is just a reminder of the fact that there are a lot of people listening into the president. This, I think, is also fairly standard, but it also tells us that we don't know who this so-called whistleblower is. We don't know what was really said. And I think we also have to recognize there are some potential dangers when an individual who may have security clearance, may not, we just simply don't know, is able to then send it around to individuals. And it's just kind of a good example of every time we turn around, first of all, there's an accusation from, in this case, an unidentified intelligence source. And then immediately his political and media opponents conclude that he has betrayed America, and this is reason enough for at least censure, if not impeachment of the United States. Have we been there before? Yes, we have. Okay, so again, first of all, Donald Trump does acknowledge that he did ask the Ukraine leader to investigate Joe Biden. And if you're not familiar, Joe Biden's son in particular was involved in some activities that really do raise questions. And I think if this information ever really did get out, I don't think Joe Biden would be able to run for the presidency. So that is certainly the case. And our friends at the Wall Street Journal point out that this call, they say, underscores Donald Trump's greatest flaw as president, which is his political narcissism. Every decision, they say, boils down to how it affects him and his reelection prospects. But before we talk about some of the other aspects of this, let me also continue with the Wall Street Journal, because they raised the same question that was in my mind, and that is, most troubling, they say, is the fact that you have all these cheerleaders wanting to actually make public private calls by the president. They say, imagine if this happened to John F. Kennedy in his calls during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or if this happened to Richard Nixon, president, during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. He says, at least the editor says, we have reached a dangerous pass if intelligence officials feel they have open season to use whistleblower laws whenever they dislike a president or one of his policies. And again, one of the other things that they point out, which is certainly worth pointing out, little of the breathless reporting of Mr. Trump's Ukraine call stops to note that Democrats and the Clinton campaign financed foreign accusations against Mr. Trump to defeat him in the 2016 election. Those accusations, though uncorroborated, were used to justify wiretaps against at least one Trump campaign official and gin up a 2-year special counsel investigation that severely damaged the Trump presidency, all without finding evidence of a Trump-Russia collusion. You're starting to see some people today saying, I just can't believe that a city president would do such a thing to harm a candidate. And you're thinking, are you just either unaware of what we've been talking about for the last 2 years, or you're just simply turning a blind eye to what was happening under the Obama administration and with Hillary Clinton against candidate Donald Trump? When we come back, let's get into a little bit more of this and then move on to some other topics, which we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The U.S. Senate has now confirmed more than 150 judicial nominees. Senator Lindsey Graham declared this was a historic milestone. These judges will be interpreting the Constitution according to its original intent for years to come. Here's the breakdown. Judges confirmed to the lower federal courts exceed 105, and there are 43 circuit court nominees that have been confirmed. Add to that 2 Supreme Court justices, and you have a total of more than 150 confirmed judicial nominees. That number far exceeds what previous presidents have been able to do at this time in their first term. Court flips are starting to take place. That is where the majority of liberal judges on a court have been replaced by a majority of conservative judges. The Third Circuit Court has already flipped. The 11th Circuit Court and the Second Circuit Court will probably flip soon. One of the most dramatic changes is taking place in the Ninth Circuit Court that covers the western states. It has traditionally been a consistently liberal court, but recently handed the president a victory on his proposed asylum policy. Here is an interesting set of statistics from a Washington Times article about judges. Most judges appointed by Democratic presidents ruled against the Trump administration's various immigration policies. By contrast, half of the Republican-appointed judges backed the administration and half did not. The report also found that most of the Democratic-appointed judges backed the Affordable Care Act, while most of the Republican-nominated judges found fault with the 2010 law. I believe that a major campaign issue for 2020 will be who will appoint federal judges. Both sides of the political aisle can see what this president has done in the last few years. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, thought I'd just spend another minute or two here on this issue of Ukraine, and we'll certainly get into it more even as the week unfolds, and perhaps it will even be a topic for our weekend discussion, but it might not be, because one of the things that this particular article says is all of this is likely to play out with the familiar Trump-era fashion, with Democratic Representative Adam Schiff making claims that turn out to be exaggerated, the media resistance hyping impeachment, Mr. Trump fighting back in tweets that call the whole thing a hoax. Without evidence of worse behavior, Mr. Trump, nothing much was likely to come of it. But nevertheless, this is just a good illustration of a couple of points I just made. Number one, maybe entirely too many people are listening in to the president's conversation. Should the president be able to speak off the record with presidents? Yes, and that probably does not happen when you have a phone call, but when those meetings take place in the Oval Office and everybody except maybe the National Security Advisor or the Defense Secretary or the State Department might be there. And so that is certainly the case. And where would we have been in the past if there weren't back channels that were used by, matter of fact, the two people just mentioned, the back channels that were used to prevent a Cuban Missile Crisis, the back channel of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, or the back channel of Richard Nixon. Here they talk about the Arab-Israeli war. How about the back channel to open up China and some of that? So, again, that's of concern. The second one, of course, is that if the president, as I will talk about in just a minute, decides to do this, there are some very ominous implications. So let me get to that one, because, again, if he's using this simply to win an election, that is another example of something that up until then was unprecedented. It becomes a precedent. And one of the things Jim Garrity says, just picture what happens next if the American people decide that it is legal and ethical for an American president to urge foreign leaders to investigate his political opponents, as it appears Donald Trump encouraged Ukrainian leaders to do, and Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. Someday there'll be another Democratic president. The country could see another Democratic president as soon as January 20th, 2021. Or it could be sometime many years after that, but someday there'll be one, and this future Democratic president could use the exact same tactic against his or her potential Republican challengers. The future Democratic president could urge Iraq or Afghanistan to investigate Dan Crenshaw's units to see if they violated any rules of engagement. And, of course, then he gives a couple of other examples. So the point he's making is when a president does something unprecedented, that action becomes a new precedent. Jim Garrity, I think, would probably agree with me that a lot of those unprecedented things happened under Barack Obama. And this is one of the reasons why all of a sudden some of the liberal progressives are upset, because Donald Trump said, well, if Barack Obama did it, why can't I do it?
And it's kind of like, well, no, we liked the guy that had a phone and a pen and used executive orders, but you can't do that. And, of course, we see how that double standard continues even more. Just before I move on, let me just mention Gary Bauer did address this last Friday, and it got me thinking because he talks about, again, that there is a whistleblower that alleges that the president actually made some sort of offer to a foreign leader. Interestingly enough, when he was writing that, just even on Friday, we weren't sure, but we were pretty sure at that time that it's the president of Ukraine. Now we know that is the case, but Gary Bauer brought up something I hadn't even thought about. Maybe other people have said this, but I think I give Gary full credit for thinking of something that never occurred to me. The president of Ukraine is a former comedian. Now, again, what does that mean? Gary Bauer suggests it's quite possible that the president simply made a joke that some of the people in the deep state misinterpreted. And you're going, no, that never happened. Remember when he got in front of a microphone and said, Russia, if you're listening and you have any of those lost emails, let us know. And, of course, he was kidding at the time. And given the fact that this president loves to tweak everybody, it's quite possible that's the case. As the president said just the other day, if I had made some kind of illegal commitment or a quid pro quo kind of comment, I'd be pretty stupid since I know all sorts of people are listening in. So it is quite possible that we may find out that that was just another one of those kind of, I want to tweak the nose of some of the people in the deep state bureaucracy. Of course, it's created quite a firestorm right now, so I'm not minimizing it, but I'm also saying that we've seen this before where people are convinced that the particular statement by the president is grounds for impeachment and then find out there's nothing there at all. But let me move to, real quickly, the last article we've posted on our website here today, because the last couple of days we've been talking about this gun control case going for the Supreme Court. And I think this particular piece from David Koppel is a really good kind of summary, because he points out that in some ways you would think that all the questions about guns, at least in the court, were settled. Because back in 2008, you had what is known as the Heller decision. This comes out of the District of Columbia, and it is a case that affirmed that there are Second Amendment rights that protect an individual right to arms. Up until that point, I think it's fair to say that there were at least some individuals that were convinced that the Second Amendment only applied to militia, only applied to the military, but did not apply to an individual. And so this particular case had to do with some, and I'll talk about it in just a minute, some of these rather restrictive laws, that's an understatement, laws dealing with handguns and a number of things in the District of Columbia. And so the Supreme Court in 2008 ruled that a Second Amendment right applies to individuals. 2 years later, in 2010, the Supreme Court came back again. This is a case known as McDonald versus Chicago, and also made the right enforceable against state and local governments, and actually made the case in that decision in 2010 that the Second Amendment is not a second-class right to be singled out for special and specifically unfavorable treatment. So what you have are some pretty solid precedents that exist, but now we have another one. But just before we do so, let me just, again, give you a sense of why these cases went to the Supreme Court. Before the Heller decision, if you lived in Washington, D.C., first of all, you could not have a handgun, and even if you had a long gun, it had to be stored in an inoperable state. In other words, it had to be, first of all, unloaded, and it had to be locked. So, again, making it essentially useless for self-defense. Today, as this article points out, people in the District of Columbia, those citizens may not only defend their homes and families with handguns or long guns, but also can carry handguns in public. So here is a very clear ruling that has come down first in the Heller case. The one out of McDonald was, again, out of Chicago that affected the handgun bans in Chicago and 6 of its suburbs. But it's more than that. I did not know this until I read this recently, that there is a case out of 2016, which we really never talked about here, which not only recognized that the Second Amendment protects arms, but not just firearms. In other words, it upheld a decision on this whole issue of electric stun guns. Also, there are some state and local places that address this, and even declared unconstitutional. There had been a ban in New York State against nunchucks, and even in Connecticut, a ban on transporting a police baton when you're moving to a new house. And then you had in some places where you have bans on switchblade knives. Those are folding knives that open automatically. And some of those were struck down in Wisconsin, but upheld in places like New Mexico. So you got kind of this patchwork quilt unfolding. And then you, of course, have the right to bear arms, which is pretty much completely denied in Hawaii and Maryland and New Jersey, and also in some of the cities and counties in places like California, New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Hence, this particular case coming out of New York, which is one that is going to try to address some of these very significant so-called gun bans. And so, again, you can see why this has become such a hot issue. And as we pointed out even last Friday, you have some of the members of the U.S. Senate saying to the court, if you don't rule in the way we think you should rule, if we get into power, we will pack the court. And so, again, this has become so politicized over just something as simple as the Second Amendment. It is, I think, very true that a lot of the pressure on the court right now has to do with whether or not you have 5 justices that would actually overturn Roe versus Wade. But the pressure is also coming in another direction as to whether or not you have 5 or even more justices that will say the Second Amendment is something that cannot be restricted by some of these state and local regulations in that regard. So if you want to read a little bit more about the upcoming Supreme Court case on guns, that's on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Micah Berteau will be with us a little bit later as we talk about his book, Love Changes Everything. And in the third hour, Dennis Prager with us. And we've even posted one of the columns that he wrote a while back that we talk about in our interview with him. And I think you will enjoy those conversations as well. Let me just mention as a program note, first of all, you will see that my commentary always appears there, my Viewpoints commentary. And I might just mention, for those of you that receive the Viewpoints commentary, I've got a letter, an email actually coming out a little bit later that I put together because I recognize some of you might say, well, how does what I support help the commentary? And of course, there are some expenses involved in the writing, taping, and distributing of this to the various radio stations and networks and those kinds of things. And so if you support this ministry, you're not only supporting, of course, the radio program, but you're also supporting the Viewpoints commentaries and the videos and all sorts of other great resources, including some things working on behind the scenes that we certainly want to tell you about a little bit later. But Viewpoints commentary for today, September 23rd, is one that I have mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning again just real quickly, because we are talking about the fact that just the other day we had a historic milestone, 150 judicial nominees confirmed. Kelly Shackelford reminded us that we had 2 more confirmed, so we're now up to 152. But I'll just use the 150 numbers because it works very well. Because of that 150, 105 are in the lower federal courts. That'd be your federal district court. That's where most of the action takes place. And as we have pointed out before, you have thousands and thousands of cases, and you're lucky if even 70 or 80 make it to the Supreme Court. So most of the decisions are made at the federal court level. Some are made at the appeals court level, and even fewer, mostly landmark cases, are made at the Supreme Court level. But 105 federal court judges that have been confirmed. Many of those individuals that we've had a chance to know about, some of whom we've had a chance to interview, some even that have worked for Kelly Shackelford, others that have provided some kind of background research. So these are really quality people, the kind of people that you would be excited about. And there's 105 of them that have already been confirmed, and more coming all the way down the pike. Then you have 43 circuit court nominees, and that helps you understand that, again, you've had some of these circuit courts that either have flipped or will flip. Second Circuit Court, Third Circuit Court, to mention just a few examples in that regard that already have. And the 11th Circuit Court probably will flip as well. So Third has flipped, Second will flip, the 11th will flip very quickly. And what I mean by flip is that whereas before, when you have very liberal judges, they don't look at the Constitution in terms of how it should be interpreted. They just read into it, or really in some cases just ignore the Constitution. They spend a lot of time, if you've ever read some of their opinions, just quoting other precedents, or sometimes quoting sociologists or things of that nature, psychologists. So they aren't really trying to keep to the actual historical intent of the Constitution. And so when you have these ones that are more conservative, it isn't they always give you a conservative answer, because they're going to respond to that in just a minute. They are just simply looking at how to apply the Constitution to those issues, and also tend to be less likely to write new law, because if there was some kind of ambiguity in the law, especially people like Neil Gorsuch say, go back and do it again. We're not here as legislators. We're here to tell you that the law doesn't make sense. So if you want it fixed, we're not going to fix it. You need to fix it. And that's the way it was supposed to be. So anyway, those are some very significant issues. And to prove my point, let's look at this. When you look at the Trump administration's immigration policies, 53 out of the 54 judges appointed by Democratic presidents always ruled against the president on the immigration policies that he has actually put forward. 53 out of 54, virtually everyone. By contrast, half
of the Republican-appointed judges backed the administration, and half did not. The half that did, 15 out of 28. The half that did not, 13 out of 28. And so you can begin to see that they weren't looking at it just in terms of, do I like this president? Do I like this immigration policy? No. Did they follow the rule? Even if I don't like the immigration policy, even if I think the immigration policy is good, I'm going to follow the way in which this was done and determine whether or not this is in the purview of the authority of the president, and did they follow the rules? And if they did not, even though I like the outcome, I'm going to rule that they did not. And so you can begin to see this argument that is sometimes made by journalists. Well, you just want your people in. No, we want people in that are actually like referees, like umpires, not individuals that are tipping the scale, if you want to change the metaphor a little bit. And another good example is if you go back and look at the Affordable Care Act as it was making its way through the federal court, circuit court, and eventually to the Supreme Court. One of the studies that was done by the Washington Times found that most of the Democratic-appointed judges backed the Affordable Care Act. Well, most, although a small percentage of the Republican-nominated judges found fault with it for very good reasons. So you can see how significant that really is. And it brings me to my commentary that we will have tomorrow. Since Nick Pitts will be sitting here, I'll give you kind of a preview, and that is to recognize not only has this been significant in terms of the lower courts, but some of these Supreme Court precedents have made a difference. And if you've listened to us over the last couple of months, ever since the decision came down on the Bladensburg case, we point out that, in a sense, is almost, I use this as my commentary, religious liberty dominoes. One domino follows, another domino falls, another domino falls, and another domino falls. And a good example is that after that decision was made, in terms of the Supreme Court saying that it's okay to have a cross in a public spot, they also made it very clear that there's nothing wrong with having a cross on a county seal. Well, there was, interestingly enough, a county seal in Pennsylvania that indeed had a cross on it. Our friends, and I put this with air quotes, from the people for the separation of church and state and people for religious freedom and all those kinds of arguments, and all sorts of people have actually challenged, especially the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I think the actual court case was Freedom from Religion Foundation, were those that were actually saying that you could not have a cross on the seal. And the judge there simply said, we've just followed what came down from the Supreme Court, and that's the case. My commentary tomorrow is one in which we point out that a year ago we had the case of Jack Phillips, who was the Colorado baker, and they ruled in favor of Jack Phillips, who was the owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop. And so as a result, that has had some real impact, because last month we had the U.S. Court of Appeals that ruled in favor of two videographers in Minnesota that actually produce commercials, live events, and other videos. And then, of course, we had the more recent one this month from the Arizona Supreme Court ruled in favor of two Christian artists. These really were calligraphers that design wedding invitations, and they do all sorts of custom designs, but in one particular case, we're deciding not to actually produce some of these invitations for a same-sex ceremony. The court, in this case, ruled that the particular case was unique, and they said they limited it just simply to the two artists, and that is certainly the case that we see right there. So in many cases, we're seeing one Supreme Court precedent now leaving a legacy and dropping a number of dominoes. But then I end my commentary by pointing out that not everybody got the message. The Washington State Supreme Court ruled against Flores Baronell Stutzman, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court. They vacated the decision, sent it back to them, saying, in light of the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop and Jack Phillips, we want you to reconsider it. They decided to reconsider it, and they said, nope, we like our decision, and so this case may have to go to the Supreme Court. So let's face it, not all the dominoes fall, and if you've ever set up some dominoes, sometimes you know if one domino is just a little further away, it doesn't knock the others down. So anyway, those are just a look at some of the commentaries that indeed either are available today or tomorrow. And it's back to one of the points I made just a few minutes ago. When you support Point of View, you're supporting the commentaries, you're supporting all the conversation that we have on all these very important topics. Today, it's going to be a wide-ranging look at everything from love and marriage and things of that nature, all the way to some of the political commentary and even censorship by the big tech companies of Dennis Prager. And it's just an illustration that we try to cover as many things as possible that affect your faith, your family, or your freedom. So if you have not had a chance to join with us, let me encourage you to visit the website pointofview.net and join the team. Or if you'd like to talk to someone, that number is 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. That's the pledge line, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention in studio with me next hour, Micah Berteau will be with us as we talk about love changes everything, and then Dennis Prager. So we have a lot more to cover. But if you were watching over the weekend, there was something else I haven't really made much comments about, and it's worth mentioning, and that is we had what might be considered one of the largest youth-led demonstrations in the history of the globe or the planet, and that is you had a lot of young people all over the world actually gathering together to talk about the need for us to address climate change. Then some of the young people there in New York then convened a youth climate summit over the weekend. And now, of course, this week is what's called Climate Week at the United Nations. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not we have major changes in the climate or not. I've written many commentaries on that. We've had people on this program to talk about it. But I want to address something that was at least a little puzzling to me, because if you were paying attention, you really heard two very different messages. But actually, that was, in a sense, two different messages tailored to two different audiences. And that is, if you think about this, we used to hear that we only have a few years left, or maybe a decade at most, before doom and gloom. Now we're hearing many of these environmentalists talking about what will happen in 50 years or 100 years. Okay, let's try to talk about the environmentalists first. The problem with a doom and gloom prediction is that it can be tested. A few months ago, I actually posted a commentary where I listed many of the failed predictions of Paul Ehrlich and George Wald and others. The problem with some of those predictions, Paul Ehrlich at Stanford, George Wald at Harvard, was when they're predicting that millions will die of starvation by 1980, well, then in 1980, 1985, 1990, you can say they didn't starve to death. That didn't really happen. And so, in a sense, the problem with saying this is going to happen in the next 10 years is, especially for those of us a little bit older, we've seen those predictions made and fail. The first article we've posted here is from our friends at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, in which they've posted dozens and dozens of newspaper articles of failed environmental predictions. By the way, if you want to print it out, make sure you have enough printer paper. I mean, this is going to take more than 30 pages to print out all this material, and especially since it jumps, you could end up using 50 pages of paper here. But it's just a good example of the fact that through the late 1960s up until now, we've had all sorts of different predictions from individuals. And so that's why I think you're hearing more and more of these environmental leaders saying this will happen in 50 years or 100 years from now, because guess what? You can't disprove that. But at the same time, we're hearing all these young people, those in the streets, and even in Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, claiming that we only have 10 to 12 years left. How is it that you have two different messages? Well, that's really simple. The young people, they don't have this sense of history. Unlike the old guy around the table here that lived through the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s and saw failed prediction after failed prediction not come true, they simply don't have that history of failed predictions. Second of all, they also don't really know their history, as we've talked about before. So they are less likely to be skeptical as adults. So the point is that we're really getting almost two messages simultaneously. Some that are saying we need to act now because we only have 10 years left, but some of the more older and wiser environmentalists saying, we better not say that because that's going to come back to bite us. So we'll just say 50 to 100 years because people are still concerned about the planet, and we'll just push it out far enough so that you can't disprove it. And, of course, those of us that have been around for a while recognize that this has been quite a cycle. We were told, for example, in the 1970s that the greatest threat was global cooling because we were putting so much our particulates in the upper atmosphere. But then we heard in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that actually we aren't going to be dealing with global cooling. We'd be dealing with global warming because we're putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And then when the temperature really hasn't changed significantly over the last century, when you understand that we're coming off of a sort of a little ice age, then we started hearing people talk about a climate change or a climate crisis. And again, you just have to have a little bit of sense of history, and I just thought it might be helpful to at least explain to you why we get some that are saying it's 50 to 100 years and others say 10 years. There is a difference, and a lot of it has to do with whether you're talking to an older audience or a younger audience. Just before we take a break, good piece by Jim Garrity. Maybe I'll post it the next day or two. It's called Inside the Mind of the Warren Voter. One of the individuals in the Democratic side that is doing the best
right now and really gaining momentum is Senator Elizabeth Warren. And he points out really kind of what's in the mindset of those individuals that are supporting her. And he says, you were shocked, horrified, depressed, bewildered, and angry when Donald Trump won. Suddenly you had to prepare to live in a nightmare for the next 4 years, and it sent you into a month-long funk. How could this happen, you wondered? Well, here's the cut line. Then suddenly it hit you. Donald Trump pulled off a trick that the devil himself would envy. This, again, is in the mindset of some of these Elizabeth Warren voters. He managed to sound the way Democrats usually sound to voters, and he made Hillary Clinton sound like the Republican people who voted against the Republicans in 2006, 2008, 2012. He kept using the term rigged to describe the election, the media, the polls, a country. Our system, Donald Trump said, is absolutely, totally rigged, he would say. He even had the nerve to claim he was the first one to use the term, which, again, okay, we know all about that. But you remember Elizabeth Warren in the 2012 Democratic Convention speaking like a friend to you, articulating a difficult truth because you needed to hear it. People feel like the system is rigged against them, and here's the painful part. They're right, the system is rigged. So the point that Jim Garrity is using is that Donald Trump really, in a sense, co-opted a term. It is very, very rare that any Republican candidate for the presidency ever says that use the term rigged. That is very rare that you can go back to Richard Nixon. You can even use Ronald Reagan, and you can use George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush, and you can think of candidates like Mitt Romney. They don't talk that way. And so all of a sudden it occurs to you, wait a minute, he used our term because, of course, who is using the term most often now? Elizabeth Warren. The system is rigged against you. Now, she means it entirely differently than Donald Trump, but I thought, again, kudos to Jim Garrity for catching that because I'd never really thought about this. And so then he goes on to talk about the different ways in which Elizabeth Warren believes the system is rigged. She's talking about it in a very different way than many other people, but it's the idea of the corporations, it's the various healthcare agencies, it's the insurance companies, it's on and on and on and on and on. And as a result, it's the whole issue of the fact that you have student loan debt and all the rest. And so when you have her talking about the system is rigged and the fact that we have to fight corruption, that's really, in a sense, why it is working. And it would be interesting if you do have a candidate, Donald Trump, and a candidate, Elizabeth Warren, both talking about the system is rigged, both talking about corruption, but talking about it in a very different way. If that indeed is what takes place, this will be one of the most interesting presidential campaigns. Of course, it's going to be anyway, but it will be one of the most interesting ones because they're using some of the same terms and meaning entirely different things about it. Well, that's all we got for this segment, and when we come back, we're going to talk about love changes everything, and then we'll have a chance to hear from Dennis Prager. All that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope you had a great weekend. And some of you would like to know, before we get into some of the conversation we're going to have today, Micah Berteau will be in studio with us, and he is with us right now. And then a little bit later, we're going to hear from Dennis Prager. So you're going to have a chance to hear from a number of individuals. But we last week, of course, had our Truth Team Week. That's where we once or twice a year maybe come to just talk about some of our financial needs. And we were fortunate to have somebody actually put a match on the table. And one of the questions people always ask is, did you make your match? Well, we eventually did. As a matter of fact, we missed it on Thursday. It's the first time I think that's ever happened, but we eventually made our match. But I have an email going out saying, okay, we just barely made the match, but we haven't made our goal, which means there's still some room if some of you would like to join with us. A little bit later, we'll talk about the way in which you can participate. You can go to the website even right now, pointofview.net. is a place where you can click on the button that said join the team. And I'm hoping that maybe some of you have been listening for some time and say, well, I might want to at least to give you a one-time gift. I hope some of you might even want to join on a monthly basis. And I noticed that this last week we, I guess, had 250 gifts. And so I don't know if that correlates with people. But if it does, that still means I think we have a broadcast that goes to a lot more than 250 people. So that means there's probably a lot of room for some of you as well. So let me just simply say that the email that's going out talks about the fact that we did eventually meet our match, but we have not met our goal. So if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate that. A gift of any amount would certainly make a great impact. And so let me encourage some of you to consider what you might do to do that. And, of course, there are various giving levels, which we've talked about, and those are on the website. And a little bit later, I'll even mention some of the places where you can call the pledge line and find out more. But I wanted to get into a couple of interviews that we're going to bring over the next couple of hours. First of all, this new book, Love Changes Everything, Finding What's Real in a World Full of Fake. And it's written by Micah Berteau, who's in studio with us today. He is the lead pastor in the house in Fort Worth. But I'm also familiar with your dad, who is, many of our listeners live in the Central Valley. So if they live in Modesto or Stockton or places like that, he has the house in that area, right?
Yeah, the house in Modesto, which is pretty crazy to me that it reaches that far as the Central Valley, spending 25 years of my upbringing in Modesto. This is, it's pretty cool. But if anybody from the Central Valley is listening, love you. Appreciate you. I'm in Fort Worth now, though. So.
Yeah, you're in Fort Worth, and we'll talk about the Fort Worth, but it is kind of interesting because you are actually part of one of the fastest growing churches, and you're a young person. We love to have our Millennial Roundtable sometimes. That will be taking place tomorrow. But at the same time, you have just a real diverse demographic. And so talk about that for just a minute, because some of these fast growing churches really understand that we don't want to just reach the Gen Y, the Gen Z. You're kind of on the younger spectrum of even in your own churches, right?
Yeah, and I like to feel young, if I can stay young forever, 33. And we launched this church, the House Fort Worth, in downtown Fort Worth in 2018, in February 2018. Right. And so we launched it, and we really felt, we knew we were going to draw who we are. We're young. We're going to draw young people. We're a few minutes from the TCU campus, so we have college students all around. We knew we were going to draw that, but we also had a heart to not just box ourselves in, I think, as you say. And yeah, it exploded. But what was so cool about it, it exploded in all demographics.
Yes.
Now, sure, there's a couple demographics that are bigger than others, but we're working on that, a year and a half old. And I think we're working through that. And so we have a lot of young families as well, because me and my wife, we have 2 little boys, a 3-year-old and a almost 2-year-old, and they're 18 months apart. So a whole lot of prayer needed on the kids' end. But, the church to us has really been a miracle. Because I don't think you ever go into planning a church thinking this thing over the span of a few months is just going to be wall to wall filled. We had to start 4 services.
I know.
I think for us, we started a church out of because we love people and we felt the call of God. We felt so called to leave the Central Valley where my dad is. He's still there.
Yeah.
And my mom as well. And they're still pastoring in Modesto. An incredible church, but we wanted to take that excitement. We saw the dynamic church that my parents built and said, God, where do you want to take this next? Not knowing that it was going to be me and my wife that ended up in downtown Fort Worth, simply because we had never been to Fort Worth. We had been to Dallas, and a lot of people were like, oh, you're going to Dallas? I was like, no, I'm going to Fort Worth. I did not know they were 2 different cities at first. And so I went to downtown Fort Worth, and I'm like, this place is beautiful. I didn't know this existed. And God, the moment we drove in, God said, this is the place. I'm going to birth something new through you. And so I had no idea what that meant, but over a long span of confirmations from God, we moved our entire family 2,000 miles, and here we are 19 months later as a church. We've seen close to 4,000 salvations, which has been really, really cool for us because I think a lot of people, that maybe even live in Texas or outside of Texas have this preconceived notion that everybody is religious and everybody's saved. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, there's another side to that story, though. And I really believe there's a lot of people looking for something authentic and real and looking for hope. And we just want that to be our church, just to be a hope for anybody who's searching. And obviously, be like, well, if I'm saved, can I go? Absolutely. You will love our church. We love to hug. We bring people in. So that's a little bit about the church, and it has exploded in all demographics. Yeah, we got a lot of young people, and I think it's important to not rule out the young people in the church today. I think we need to have ways to invite in the quote unquote millennial and the 18-year-old
and the unchurched too.
And the unchurched.
And you've created an environment which I thought we'd talk about for just another few minutes, because a lot of people say, then this so-called Bible Belt and even Fort Worth have a lot of churches, and I'm well aware of the churches that are there. And a lot of people say, well, when I see these churches explode, it's because they plant a church at a time when people are moving into that region, in the suburbs. Sure. But instead, you're downtown. You're going, wait a minute. This is a place that has pretty much been given over to not a Christian environment, but actually just the opposite. Yeah. So there are probably some people saying right now all over the country, they're saying, okay, what are your secrets? And I know one of them, of course, is prayer. Without a doubt. I mean, you've covered that with prayer. Number 2, they probably can tell by now, enthusiasm, authenticity, and creating kind of a body life. But in some respects, you had every reason to not be successful. And here you are in terms of numbers. And I also think in terms of spiritual vitality, very successful.
Yeah. And going to a downtown area where, everything's already built out, everything's kind of done, if you will. But we felt like God wants to do something fresh and maybe a little pocket in a downtown, in a city area where we really feel God's going to move in a new way, a fresh way. Even our mission statement, save the lost, revive the found. A lot of people are like, revive the found. Wait, I've never heard of it like that. And I'm like, I think there's a lot of people that know God, but don't know God. They only know him at a church level.
Yes.
And we bring, a lot of excitement, a lot of passion, but one of the most common things that I've heard about our church from day one is authentic.
Yes. Well, let me come back, and this is, I think, another illustration, because people say, well, then they probably just aren't preaching from God's Word. This book is about the book of Hosea. Yeah. And so I think it just illustrates, again, sound biblical teaching in addition to prayer and authenticity. Mm-hmm. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The U.S. Senate has now confirmed more than 150 judicial nominees. Senator Lindsey Graham declared this was a historic milestone. These judges will be interpreting the Constitution according to its original intent for years to come. Here's the breakdown. Judges confirmed to the lower federal courts exceed 105, and there are 43 circuit court nominees that have been confirmed. Add to that 2 Supreme Court justices, and you have a total of more than 150 confirmed judicial nominees. That number far exceeds what previous presidents have been able to do at this time in their first term. Court flips are starting to take place. That is where the majority of liberal judges on a court have been replaced by a majority of conservative judges. The Third Circuit Court has already flipped. The 11th Circuit Court and the Second Circuit Court will probably flip soon. One of the most dramatic changes is taking place in the Ninth Circuit Court that covers the western states. It has traditionally been a consistently liberal court, but recently handed the president a victory on his proposed asylum policy. Here is an interesting set of statistics from a Washington Times article about judges. Most judges appointed by Democratic presidents ruled against the Trump administration's various immigration policies. By contrast, half of the Republican-appointed judges backed the administration and half did not. The report also found that most of the Democratic-appointed judges backed the Affordable Care Act, while most of the Republican-nominated judges found fault with the 2010 law. I believe that a major campaign issue for 2020 will be who will appoint federal judges. Both sides of the political aisle can see what this president has done in the last few years. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention this book has just come out, so again, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It is entitled Love Changes Everything, Finding What's Real in a World Full of Fake. We talked about fake news, and how about fake love?
Yeah.
And again, we have a link so that if your bookstore does not have it, it's available in paperback and Kindle, so you can simply click on that there. If you click on the picture of Micah, you'll find out a little bit more about the house and all the other things that are taking place there. But I thought right off the bat I would get to this other issue, because people listening to this might say, Micah, okay, well, you're drawing kids in because you have a real superficial message. This book is on Hosea.
Yeah.
Now, that right off the bat, I thought was kind of interesting because, you know, for your typical, let's just talk about a lot of the millennials, a lot
Sure.
of people that are your age group, if they have been to maybe a Sunday school class, they know about Jonah, Noah, David and Goliath.
Yeah.
You say Hosea, and they go, what? You say Gomer, and the Gomer pile. I mean, they don't have a clue. And in some respects, then, as you were preaching through this and now turn this into a book, this is new territory for everybody, just about, right?
Yeah. It's not your Sunday school story. I mean, it's a little bit, out there as far as when I'm going to be presenting it, maybe to some younger people, and they've never heard the story. So a lot of them are reading about the story for the first time. And I think for me, the first thing I want to make sure that our church, even though we do draw a lot of young people, I think we do have a lot of spread in our demographic because of my dad, who's raised me in the Word of God. So I know that there's like this blanket statement with guys that are my age, and may be true, maybe not, to whoever we're talking about. But I think for me, my dad always pushed me to go to school, and I have my master's degree. It doesn't mean I'm a master at anything, but it does mean that we have a hunger for the Word of God,
right,
especially at our house. So when I brought around, I said, you know what? When I talk about the love of God, how can I best illustrate this and bring this? And I've traveled with this message all over the world as well. And I'm thinking about this. I'm like, gosh, Hosea and Gomer is not your first go-to. However, for me, when you unpack it, it's so full of truth, depth, and really a picture. It gives you this very clear picture of what God's love is all about. And again, we're saying it's odd because it actually is. I actually call it an awkward story.
Yeah.
It is an awkward story where this man of God, a prophet.
Those first three chapters are just kind of odd, right?
Like,
I mean, they're just odd. I mean, no matter how you look at it.
it's almost, and like at times when I'm preaching it, I have to prep it. Like, guys, if you've never heard this story before, one, if you're single, you don't need to follow the Hosea. You know, how he found, because God told him to marry Gomer, which was a harlot and promiscuous woman. And you're sitting there like, where are we going with this? You know, like, what is going on right now? It is a very odd. However, I think when you journey through that story,
yes,
like I have 100 times, really probably a couple thousand times to really get to a place where I felt comfortable writing a book about it.
Mm-hmm.
I really felt like I had so many things come to life for me, so many revelations, so many things that I started to learn and glean from, and said, you know what, God, if you want me to write this book, which is a whole different story in and of itself, because I wasn't praying to write a book. I was actually finishing my master's, and we had, at the time, my kids were 2 and 1, so they were like really needy. We had at the time, a 9-month-old church, so I didn't want a book on my table.
For anything else to
I
fill
was
out your
not asking God,
list.
please bring. Well, it was the craziest thing. The agent came to my table, the publisher came to my table and said, we want you to write something. And I said, God's really been working me on this love with Hosea and Gomer. And so that's kind of where this is at. But I think that story has transcended a lot of cultural ideas. And I attack that a little bit. I think the shallowness of our culture today. And that we're really just falling for what's fake in culture. And I think our culture can be defined as two things, is counterfeit and desensitized. I think they're both counterfeit and desensitized. I think we're desensitized in the way where, especially with love, because it comes in the format of movies, songs, reality TV shows. You can find the culture's version of love anywhere you want. And what we're doing is we're buying into it. You know, we watch a TV show, we watch a movie, we're like, well, that's how it should have been, and I'm currently not experiencing that in my marriage. My marriage doesn't look like that movie. Am I missing something? And I'm like, no, what we're doing is we're taking the bait of what is really just emotional love. And emotional love, God's love can be emotional, but God's love is based in truth. That God's love is with you every single day, whether you feel it emotionally or not. It's a choice. And I think it's from that love that we get to live. That's why the Bible even talks about in Ephesians that we're called to grow down. Our roots grow down into the foundation of God's love. That's what's real, not this temporary feeling. I think we're also counterfeit. We have a counterfeit culture, which we love fake items. Even in this day, like we love to wear name brand stuff that's not the actual name brand. We got it off some cheap website, but we've fooled everybody else thinking that I'm really able to afford this name brand. I'm like, nah, the only person that knows who's not, who knows it's not real is you when you go home at night, and you have to live with that. And I don't think there's a lasting joy when you trick people of someone that you're not. And I think that's really where I'm coming from. And I even remember, to illustrate it through a story, I went to New York when I was like 13 years old. We went on a school trip, right? One of those trips we all went together. And I wanted a Rolex watch. Yeah. So I told my parents.
I love those fake, genuine Rolex watches. You see that? Yeah.
And I was telling my parents, I was like, I'm gonna buy a watch, and they're like, go for it. They gave me a few bucks, and so we went to New York with the class, and I found the first guy on the street on the sidewalk that was kind of sketchy, right? Like, why is he standing behind a table? Why does he have a long jacket on? And I walked up to the table. I was like, I want to buy a watch. And he like opens his jacket and it's like all lined. I thought that was only movies, but like the guy had watches lined in his jacket. And I was like, oh my goodness, what do? I want the gold Rolex. And so he pulls out the gold Rolex. He said, that'll be $7. And I only had 4. So I said, I only got 4. He said, I'll give it to you for 4. I was like, yes, I was so excited about it. And I put this Rolex on. I'm fully convinced. I'm 13 years old. I'm fully convinced it's real. I show my friends and everything like that. They're making fun of me. They know it's fake, but I'm like, nah, it's real. And I felt good because I was like, I have some validity to my life because look at what I got. About an hour later, I took it off and my wrist was green.
Yeah.
It was absolutely green. And then all my friends were making fun of me. Like, I told you it was fake. And then another hour passed and the whole thing just fell apart. Pieces were falling off of it. And I realized the only time I felt good about this watch was at the transaction.
Right.
That I had to pay for something that was fake and not going to last. And I think that we do that in character. I think we pay for things and we pay for instant validation, even through social media, if we have any kind of social media, or we look for people's compliments and we find it from different places of acceptance. And if I just could be acceptance, but that's only temporary. And I don't think God wants us to live in the temporal world. He wants us to have this eternal foundation of love that is from Jesus Christ, which is the story of Hosea and Gomer. I call it one of the most beautiful versions or just illustrations of God's love in the entire Bible, not because it's like, oh, is that against Jesus? No, it is the story of Jesus. Like at the end of Hosea and Gomer, it's the story of how much God loves us, that he would love the world so much that he would send us and try to save us from a counterfeit culture so we would stop paying for what's fake and start living in what's real.
Yeah, and it really gets back to the idea of sacrificial love. After the break, I want to talk about that for just a minute because in some respects, you might say, well, my spouse, husband or wife, isn't meeting all the needs for me. And so as a result, you just say, well, then if it didn't work for me, I'll just go. And this is why the divorce rate has always been so high and why people in your generation aren't necessarily getting married because they're saying, well, is this really going to work out?
Yeah.
And so it really is the theme of sacrificial love. So we'll come back and talk about that. And of course, you talked about desensitization and some of the things that are happening there and how love drives out hate, which is another issue that we talk about quite a bit. So those are all very important topics, which we've certainly begin to surface in the book. Love Changes Everything. And if nothing else, for those of you that maybe teach a Sunday school class and say, I never really thought about teaching the book of Hosea, this is going to give you almost 200 pages of great material coming from a very enthusiastic preacher and teacher at the house, which is the house in Fort Worth. And some of you in California perhaps have run into the other house there in Modesto. So that's your dad. So anyway, let me just mention real quickly, we need to take a break. But when we do so, let me just real quickly encourage you that if you have not helped us with our Truth Team Week, you can still give us a call. That pledge line number is 800-347-5151. There's some people willing to take your phone call, and a gift of any size would be greatly appreciated. We certainly would not come to you if we did not have a financial need, and if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate that. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Micah today and talking about his book, and a little bit later we'll open up the phones in case you'd like to join the conversation. Genuine love or fake love, sacrificial love or as long as love shall last. That's the contrast. We'll talk about that more right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation in studio with us, Micah Berteau. Let me just mention a little bit later that we're going to have Dennis Prager with us, an interview that I actually pre-recorded, and we'll be having a chance to hear that in the next hour. Love changes everything, finding what's real in a world full of fake. Let's talk about the difference between real love and fake love. And you talked about this idea of, Micah, that really Hollywood has affected that. Forget Hollywood. How about television? Tonight is Monday night. Okay. I know that oftentimes on a Monday night, they got The Bachelor, The Bachelorette. I think it's now The Bachelors or whatever in Paradise, something like that. I'm not endorsing any of those, by the way. But you do have just so many fake messages coming that your generation that is probably even more media-wise than mine are just maybe unknowingly being affected by these fake images of love, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even bringing up The Bachelor, I think I was just telling you a second ago, years ago, I got asked to be on The Bachelorette. I think it was like season 8 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I got the call, but I was in relationship already with my future wife. So they called, they're like, we want you to be on. And I didn't know my friends turned in the application, the picture. So they set me up. And typically when you hear an interview from one of the people on there, that's kind of what happens. Their friends kind of did it for them.
Yeah.
And it totally happened for me. And they wanted me to come out. And so I just said, I'm already in a relationship. They were actually really happy for me. Well, I was like, oh, you really do care about me being in a relationship. But it was, anyway. So,
so there it is. That's a perfect connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, man, so it worked out for me not having to go on that show just because that show is one of the main reasons that you look at today our dysfunction.
Yes.
You know, as much as I even will have some friends, and I know I've known people that have been on the show and everything like that, I still think it's projecting a message of us trying to find something that is, again, temporal, that is right here, right now. You can feel it. And maybe the biggest thing that you're missing in your life is a husband or a wife. Yeah. Now, if anybody that is listening is married, you know that's not true. That's not the end all be all. I think when you get married, it's not two halves become a whole. It's two wholes coming together, saying I'm already 100% in Christ and I'm 100% in Christ. When you're two halves trying to come together, it's a mess because then you're trying to find
codependent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're trying to fill the void in your soul with the person that you're looking across the table with, and they don't have the answers for you. But what I've found that marriage is supposed to be there, that it's a compliment. Whoever you're dating right now, it should be a compliment. And I think that our marriages, someone asked me, they're like, in our young, kind of the young marriage, if you will, why are we struggling so much with marriage? I'm like, I don't know if we know how to date anymore. I think that's why. And I think we're looking at TV shows and we're looking for a feeling. And to me, that is the definition of fake love. We're finding and fighting for a feeling. We have to feel this love. Follow your heart, as everybody says. Yet the Bible describes that as one of the most deceitful things you could follow above all is your heart. I don't follow my heart. I follow the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is called our guide. He's called the one that's going to talk to me about the next step, not my heart. I don't need to follow my heart. And I think that we are being branded and we are taking the bait. We are being lied to. And I think we need to wise up a little bit and be rooted in the Word of God and say, you know what? Culture, the only way culture can get better is if Christians can get stronger. That's the only way. We can't just keep blaming culture for being culture. I think that we have to stop taking what they're giving and defining love the way that they define love and start, looking at this whole dating 25 people at one time, define love. Like I even saw one, I just talked about this with my church people. We were having a good laugh on Sunday about this. There's a show that's like you put a blindfold on and you literally, all you do is you kiss 10 straight people and then you choose, whatever you want. You choose 1 out of the 10. That's the person I want to go on dates with. And I'm like, you're not choosing, what's real love. You're just choosing your favorite toothpaste at that point. So I think it's kind of awkward. But this is what we're branding as, hey, you need to go out there and you need to find a feeling. You need to find something that makes you feel better. And even in marriage, I think that when we're trying to find real love, we're trying to look at our spouse and say, I need you to meet my needs. I need you to do more. I need you to be somebody else. And at the end of the day, when we're not rooted in the real love, which is Jesus Christ, which is I can wake up validated. And it's this whole statement that I can wake up living from love, not for love. I live from love, not for love. I live from validation, not for validation. I live from acceptance, not for acceptance. And I think when I can live that way, I will not be thirsty for things that I don't need. I won't lust after things that will only give me a high for maybe a few hours. I won't need those things. And my marriage, and I found this, because we have to work at marriage, me and my wife? Absolutely. I think every marriage you have to work at, but at the end of the day, when you sit down, if God's love isn't the center of our love, we are going to fall short in trying to love each other adequately, because the only way that I can project real love is being founded in real love.
So again, not living for love, but to live from love. Very good point. Let's come back to the book of Hosea, because there's a point in which Hosea and Gomer are married. They have some kids.
Yeah.
And then she goes back
Yeah.
into prostitution. And you make the argument that that is kind of a metaphor, an illustration for where we find ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, I think that we are not the hero in the story. We are not Hosea. We are Gomer, absolutely. And here it is, they get married, and then you think it's like this beautiful Disney story is unfolding. And
Yeah.
you're like, they have three
Live
kids.
happily ever after.
Yeah, the happily ever after.
Doesn't
The
happen.
bells are ringing.
Does
The-
not.
You know, and then all of a sudden, along the timeline, after three kids have come, now Gomer decides to leave. And we don't get really much explanation.
No.
She just takes off. Now it just
going back to her previous life.
yeah, and she
essentially.
didn't just leave.
Yeah,
She
and
went
people do
back
that.
to
Yeah.
walking the streets.
Mhm.
And I think that was a big point to say that I think a lot of people think they need a scenery change when they actually need a heart change. That they don't need, but like, oh, if I just move churches. No, you've moved churches the last 15 years. In 15 years, you've had 20 churches. I don't know if it's the church anymore. At some point, we have to sit ourselves down. And I usually say this, I think it's time to put ourselves on trial instead of putting everything and everyone else on trial. I think we need to put ourselves on trial and say, God, what am I missing? You know, am I not living in this love? And like Gomer, she was one decision away from who she used to be. I think that is a dangerous way to live. And I think there's a lot of people that live that way. We're just one choice away from making a decision that will bring our past into our present. And our whole calling in life with God, if we have the grace of God on our lives and we're moving forward, that's exactly it. Is we're not supposed to live in a cycle like the Israelites, then they walked in a circle in the desert. That's not our calling in life. We are called to move forward. I don't want to revisit some things that God freed me from. I don't want to go back to those things, and I don't want to live one decision away. But Gomer, yeah, she takes off, and Hosea in Hosea 3:1, because Hosea is like, what do I do now? And he says something so powerful. God says to Hosea, he's like, here's what I want you to do. Go love your wife again.
Yes,
And
incredible.
Gosh.
Let me come to one other point, because throughout the book you talk about this idea that God is enough. And yet you ask anybody, what do you need? Just a little bit more money, just maybe a little more free time.
Yeah.
Just I get caught up in it. I think all of us get caught up in it.
Yeah.
And there is a sense in which sometimes we need to say, God is sufficient, and the love of God is sufficient, even in the difficult circumstances where your cup really is only half full, and it may not be filling up anytime soon.
Yeah. I think we have to sit here wherever we're at, wherever you're listening to this, and realize all of my strivings, whatever I'm running after, if God is absent from it, it will only produce absence for me.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have God as my center and as my focus. He is who I worship. He is who I give my adoration to. He is everything. And I think when He is enough, you will not search the world for what is not enough for you. God is the only one. Jesus Christ is the only one that can provide you long-lasting joy, peace that is beyond understanding, patience when you don't want to be patient with anybody. He's the only, it's founded in that, in Him alone. And I think that if we could start living from this place where God is not just enough as well, I think He's more than enough, as you know. If we can say God is more than enough, then we can start to define what is not enough.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, let's give you a chance if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. 1-800-351-1212 is the on-air line, and so if you would like to join us, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. That's different than the pledge line, which I'll give before the top of the hour one more time, just in case some of you would like to join with us financially. But, of course, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Micah, like to know a little bit more about this book, Love Changes Everything, all of it is available at the website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we still have our banner for Truth Team up. We had our Truth Team week last week. And if you have not joined with us, I think we had a number of individuals that did, but I'm still sure there's room for you. We would greatly appreciate you clicking on that banner And as you go there, you'll also find my commentary today, which is all about the historic court appointments and some of the very positive things happening, not only in the Supreme Court, but the Circuit Court of Appeals and federal courts as well. So lots of material. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Micah Berteau with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Love Changes Everything, published by Fleming Revell, which is actually a section of Baker. I've published with Baker Books, and I've known our friends up there at Grand Rapids for some time. About a 200-page book. Great material, some of it from your preaching, teaching, of course, stories and all the rest. But just before we get back into some of the content, talk about how people can use this, because I think some people that maybe would like to study this and say, I've heard about the book of Hosea, and I'd like to maybe find out a little bit more about this crazy story that just goes all over the place. What's its significance, how it relates to God's love, and those kinds of things. But I also thought, given the fact that you've got a number of chapters here, and I was just looking at the fact that you have basically 15 chapters, so you could almost do a chapter a week if you were going to start a Bible study and read a chapter and then have some conversation. How have you used it in the church, and how would you suggest people might use it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the best ways that we can do it is small group settings. I think a lot of people I've heard have bought in a whole box full of the books, and they'll spread them out to their friends, and they'll just go chapter by chapter. Now, it is an easy read. It's not like some, again, going back to my schooling and my master's, it's not one of those,
not a heavy theological treatise.
No, it's an easy read.
Yeah.
It's digestible,
Right.
and I wrote it in that way on purpose.
You wrote the way you speak, basically.
Yeah. It's very conversational, if you will.
Yeah.
And because of that, I wrote it. I wanted it to be that because I wanted people to share it. We have this thing called Share the Love, where I believe that buy one for you, but buy one for somebody that needs to know that someone and God really loves them so much. So that's one of the ways is you could buy it for a friend that maybe is not really sure about this whole Christian thing. Is God even real? It's going to be very digestible for them. I think small groups, we're using it in our small groups right now. We have dozens of small groups all over the Metroplex here in Dallas-Fort Worth that meet, and we're talking about this topic, and they're going 2 chapters at a time. You can go 1 chapter, you can go 2 chapters at a time. I think that's another way to really break down and just have great conversation pieces from it. I think it needs to be talked about more.
And one of the things I might just mention is even in the book here, you have a link to your website, micahberteau.com.
Yes.
If you know how to spell that,
I was
you
gonna
win
say,
an award.
It is the hardest name to
and
spell.
So, again, that's why we have some of the information at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net's all you really need to know.
Okay.
So if you want to order the book or those kinds of things, it is there. And, again, it's, again, a French name, but it nevertheless is one that is easy to find on the website. So we've made it real easy there. You got a number of notes and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But let's just, again, talk about why this was so essential. I want to have you here for 2 reasons. Number one, this really dramatic church has exploded in a place you wouldn't expect it. I expect churches to grow when they're in a suburban neighborhood where people are moving in and all the rest. Downtown Fort Worth or downtown any city, those usually don't do as well quite as easily as yours has. So I wanted people to hear your growth story. But the other reason I wanted to have you on was simply because we just have so much fake love out there.
Yeah.
And people are going to divorce courts every single day, choosing to get divorced over reasons that other couples, because they have a biblical view of marriage and love, choose to work through. And you're going to see this more and more in your ministry as you even grow more and more. This is an antidote to the I'm not going to get married because I'm afraid I'm going to get divorced, and it's an antidote to I think my spouse is not meeting my needs and I'm going to go get divorced, right?
Absolutely. I think really no matter who you are, what you're experiencing, what season you're in, if you have any sense of lack sometimes, it's so easy to give your mind over and your heart over in any given day straight back over to the lust of the flesh, the wanting of what's in front of us, the desire that's not going to bring us the fulfillment. And it's so easy, and I think it's so natural that I think a lot of us don't even know. We're like, a lot of people will be like, I don't have an addiction. I'm good. I think we have an addiction to our flesh sometimes. What we have an addiction to is that we have an addiction to our wants. And really God's love also comes down to not just comforting, but correcting. It has to get to a place where when you not just accept God's love as head knowledge, but it becomes an experience. As the Bible says, you have to experience God's love. It says you'll never understand it, but you need to experience it. When you experience it, it'll start to guide you. It'll take you as you are, but it won't keep you as you are. This love will challenge you. It will convict you. It will walk with you into areas and say, no, don't do that. Don't go there. Don't say that. Don't smoke that. It'll start to really challenge your personal convictions, because I'd be like, I don't want anybody to touch my personal convictions. Well, God's love will get all up in your system and start to really challenge. And for me, that's one of the most important messages. Is like, okay, once we're founded in God's love, now what? Like, what good? It doesn't get the laundry done. I hear Jesus loves me on Sunday from the pastor. It doesn't feed my kids. What does this do for me? It does nothing for me. And I think we're missing it because we're desensitized to an extent where we hear about love all the time. I love my spouse. I love nachos.
Yeah.
I love tacos. And I love in this Metroplex, I love the Cowboys, and then all of a sudden you come to church and then it's like, hey, God loves you. And you're like, well, okay, cool. I love my favorite sports team too. So what we bring God's love down to a human mindset, to a limited context of what our life is. And I think God wants to break that mold and break that box and say, my love is higher, it's deeper, it's wider, it's longer than anything that you've ever thought or experienced. Now with that, when you start to experience it and when you start to accept it, which is right here, right now, you don't have to do anything else. God did it all through Jesus on the cross. All you have to do is stop for a moment, breathe, and say, you know what, God, I need your love right here, right now. I receive it. what will start to happen, I think, over the coming days and the coming weeks is when you start walking in real love, you'll start to walk in a different direction than when you were previously walking in. Just like when Hosea runs and finds Gomer, and he finds her on an auction block. She's about to be sold to the highest bidder, and Hosea pays for what's already his. And if that's not a picture of Jesus,
that's a great.
I don't know what is. And Jesus paid back the price that we could not pay and bought back his children. And really, just even on this last note, Hosea, the name means salvation, and
Right.
Gomer's name means completion. And not to say that we have completion. I think salvation needs a vessel. Salvation needs to be accepted by somebody that is incomplete, which is me and you. And at the end of the day, that's what love and grace of Jesus Christ is all about.
Well, again, I think if you've ever read the book of Hosea, and I recognize a lot of our listeners maybe never have, and so I hope this will encourage you to do so. Yeah. But as you read it, you go, what does this mean? Certainly the broadest issue is, of course, God's love and sending Jesus, paying the penalty that we could not pay, that we might be saved out of that auction block.
Yeah.
But also there's some other great application points all the way through the 15 chapters in your book. And I just think it'd be a great way to provide an antidote to the kind of false view of love that we have right now. You know, the Apostle Paul talks about we should not be conformed to this world in Romans 12. He talks about the fact that even in 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, he talks about the fact that we should be tearing down strongholds and lofty thoughts raised up against the knowledge of God. Yeah. He talks about to the Colossians the fact that they should not take these false views and these empty promises. And so, if nothing else, I hope that this would cause you to look at a biblical view of love rather than the cultural view of love. Micah, it's been great to have you in studio. Let's see if we can invite you to this round table with the other millennials and see how you interact with some of them. That'd be great.
Would love to. Thank you for having me.
Again, the book is entitled Love Changes Everything. Micah Berteau with us, and we have that information on our website, pointofview.net. As we go to a break here, let me encourage you to maybe click on that button that says Join the Truth Team if you have not done so. Or, of course, if you'd like to talk to someone on the pledge line and say, yeah, I'd like to just give you a gift. I appreciate the fact that you are bringing these kinds of programs to you. Again, that number is 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. That's the pledge line. And when we come back, Dennis Prager, who was in studio with us, we'll have a chance to hear that interview and talk about some really important issues in our culture. That coming up right after this.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
We're privileged to have in studio with us Dennis Prager, and as anybody that has listened to this program knows, we quote from him quite often. Dennis, as a matter of fact, I did a search on our website here. 55 times your name shows up, and those are either columns you've run or sometimes commentaries I've written on that. So a lot of our listeners are very familiar with some of the things that you've been doing.
That is a big honor. Thank you, sir.
And also, that doesn't even include all the references to PragerU, and I thought maybe we'd start off with that, because one of the questions I get from our listeners is, where are we in that situation? We're still waiting for the Google-friendly 9 commandments.
You know about that? Isn't that great?
That is just, you got to tell that story, because it's such a fun story.
It's actually, it's fun in the sense, and I agree with you totally. It's fun in the sense that the absurd is fun. And I always say to people, I rather laugh than cry, but it's really worthy of both crying and laughing.
Oh, sure.
So in a nutshell, I was testifying at the U.S. Senate at the invitation of Senator Cruz. You're a wonderful senator, and he is a wonderful senator. And he had, among other people, one of the heads of Google. Now, Google, which owns YouTube, has placed over 100 of PragerU videos on the restricted list. And so one of them, incredibly, is a video on the Ten Commandments, and I happen to have made it. I don't make all PragerU videos. I only make about 10% of them. 90% others present. But I presented this one on because I'm writing a Bible commentary, and that's my big passion is to spread the Ten Commandments. Anyway, so he looks at the Google man. Senator Cruz said, "I'm curious, why did you put Mr. Prager's video on the Ten Commandments on the restricted list?" And he said, "Well, it mentions murder." And I was sitting in the U.S. Senate. You know, you can't burst out laughing in the U.S. Senate. It's not respectful. But I thought, I feel like I've entered the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
The Ten Commandments does mention murder, and we would like kids to hear, do not murder. That's actually a good thing for kids to hear. Should not be lumped with violence and pornography. So anyway, when it was my chance to speak, I said, look, I think we're on the basis of what I just heard, Senator Cruz, we're going to release a Google-friendly 9 commandments.
9 commandments. I just love that. I used that in a commentary recently, and just illustrates how silly it is, because you have not actually received from them all sorts of explanations why so often
not one
that these are restricted.
Correct.
And these are by individuals, as I've pointed out before, prime ministers,
yes.
Individuals of tremendous stature,
yes,
and they're all
right.
restricted. It's just amazing what has happened there.
It's a very, very serious issue. Google has the authority over nearly all of that which is transmitted over the internet in terms of information. If you don't go through Google and its subsidiary YouTube, you don't go anywhere, basically. So it would be like the analogy I give, because people say, well, you can't demand free speech from a private entity, only from the government. I said, fine. Well, let me ask you. If Delta, United, and American announced, if you come on board any of our planes with the Wall Street Journal, you may not board. They're private companies. Can they do that? Why is that any different than what Google is doing?
Yes, and you used that in one of those Wall Street editorials that we posted
good.
there. It's one of those articles
that's
there.
right.
And as a matter of fact, we put out these little booklets, and this one on social media is a good example of all the examples we've been able to pull together. And you're not the only person in which there's just been all sorts of censorship by the big tech companies. So
I
it's
wish we
something to
were
pay
the
attention.
only person.
Yes, but unfortunately,
No,
going
and
all the
it'll
way
get
back to
bigger.
Mike Huckabee being pulled off simply because they went at a Chick-fil-A day and all sorts of things. The Manhattan Declaration just the other day we were talking about example after example after example. So
That's
something's
right.
going to have to take place. So where are we on that particular court case?
Well, there's no way to know. I mean, it's now at the Ninth Circuit, which has not been conservative friendly. And by the way, it's so silly to even say conservative friendly. It hasn't been liberty friendly. You know, what do we stand for, conservatives? We stand for liberty, essentially. I mean, it's just we stand for very mainstream things, you know, like liberty, like the idea that it is best to get married before you have a child. I mean, when you think of the radical things we stand for that were called right-wingers, I mean, I'm a Jew from New York, grew up a liberal Democrat. I haven't changed my mind on almost any issue. And now they're all called conservative. That's
Yes.
I'm a living example of the idiocy of it. It's conservative to say have a child after you marry. That's conservative. It's conservative to say, you know, you shouldn't curse publicly. That's conservative. It's so amazing to me. Look, I guess the Ten Commandments are conservative.
Apparently.
Honor your father and mother. What are you talking about? My father and mother are no better than me. That's the current version.
And again, it just illustrates that point. You know, when you were talking about left and liberalism, one of the things that you've changed our thinking around this table is we used to use the word left and liberal in the same
good.
way.
You made my day.
And one of the things that you've pointed out is that the typical liberal, and we've had Alan Dershowitz on,
Yes.
and we've had Jonathan Haidt, and we can talk about Jordan Peterson and all sorts of people. They would, as a typical classical liberal, say, I may disagree with you, but I defend the right for you to say that.
Yes.
Your argument is, and it's one that we now use around the table, is that the left says, no, you don't have a right to those ideas. It's homophobic, xenophobic,
Right.
Islamophobic,
That's
or
why
whatever.
our battle is to win over the liberal. That's our battle. You, dear liberals, are not leftists. You may not be conservatives, but your enemy is not us. The mortal threat to liberalism comes from the left, not the right.
Yes. And again, that's one of those points that we've tried to make. And again, that's just, again, a debt of gratitude. And we almost always mention your name when we talk about that.
That means a lot to me. Not that you mentioned my name. It means a lot to me that you got that. A lot of people go, why does Prager make these distinctions? They're critical. We'll never win the liberal over. The war is not against liberals. The war is against leftists.
Yes. And again, the leftist lexicon right now says that, for example, the NRA is a domestic
Is that
terrorist
beyond belief?
organization. I was born in Berkeley, grew up in the San Francisco
You
Bay
were?
Area, so I recognize the kind of things that the Berkeley City Council used to come out with. But this is the Board of Supervisors, and it was unanimous. And they're also saying that anybody who has dealings with this, that could be somebody who's on the membership roll of the NRA, can't be a part of that. And then they want other cities to do that. That's a little bit more than what the Berkeley City Council used to do.
Berkeley City Council just changed manhole to personhole.
Yes, I know that.
These people are really preoccupied with important items.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue hearing the interview that I did recently with Dennis Prager. He couldn't be with us live, so we certainly have played this for you to hear today. And, of course, a little bit later, we'll open up the phones if you have some comments. I also have a number of other issues that I want to address here in the news. There are quite a number of things happening simultaneously, but I thought it would be really good for you to have a chance to hear from Dennis Prager. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this equation, and it is one of the articles we've posted on the website, The Equation That Explains Evil. And that is a commentary that came out recently, and it had just come out the day before we did the interview, so we'll talk about that. A little bit later, we'll talk about this dangerous world that we find ourselves in and how to be responsible and how to think about this from a Judeo-Christian point of view. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dennis Prager right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The U.S. Senate has now confirmed more than 150 judicial nominees. Senator Lindsey Graham declared this was a historic milestone. These judges will be interpreting the Constitution according to its original intent for years to come. Here's the breakdown. Judges confirmed to the lower federal courts exceed 105, and there are 43 circuit court nominees that have been confirmed. Add to that 2 Supreme Court justices, and you have a total of more than 150 confirmed judicial nominees. That number far exceeds what previous presidents have been able to do at this time in their first term. Court flips are starting to take place. That is where the majority of liberal judges on a court have been replaced by a majority of conservative judges. The Third Circuit Court is already flipped. The 11th Circuit Court and the Second Circuit Court will probably flip soon. One of the most dramatic changes is taking place in the Ninth Circuit Court that covers the western states. It has traditionally been a consistently liberal court, but recently handed the president a victory on his proposed asylum policy. Here is an interesting set of statistics from a Washington Times article about judges. Most judges appointed by Democratic presidents ruled against the Trump administration's various immigration policies. By contrast, half of the Republican-appointed judges backed the administration and half did not. The report also found that most of the Democratic-appointed judges backed the Affordable Care Act, while most of the Republican-nominated judges found fault with the 2010 law. I believe that a major campaign issue for 2020 will be who will appoint federal judges. Both sides of the political aisle can see what this president has done in the last few years. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again to the interview that I did with Dennis Prager. Let me just mention that we have a link to his website, but also information about something we'll be talking about in this interview, No Safe Spaces, which is a movie. We have a teaser there. Adam Carolla and Dennis Prager are part of that. And this particular part of the interview, I had posted a piece that I actually had written, and we've posted it on our website. And it has the equation that explains evil. The equation is GI minus W equals E. GI stands for good intentions minus wisdom equals evil. And this is what Dennis Prager had to say about that equation.
The thing that distinguishes people who do good from people who don't is not that the people who don't wake up in the morning and think, gee, I want to do evil today. Very few people think that way. Most people who do bad things or support bad people think they're doing good. The people who supported the communists, the greatest genocidal movement in the history of the world, they thought that they were helping humanity for equality, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-fascism, etc. So what distinguishes two people, both of whom want to make the world good? One has the opposite view of the other. What distinguishes them is wisdom. You will like this because we're both religious, so you will like this. In the Haggadah, the Passover prayer book, as said at the Passover Seder, and this is 2,000 years old, there is a statement, and anyone could look it up in the traditional Haggadah, or however it'll be spelled in English. So there are 4 children. It says there are 4 children, and you have to teach each one how to ask, how did God take us out of Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with this?
I am.
Oh, good. So you know there is the wise one, the bad one, the one who doesn't know how to ask, and the simple one. And I remember as a kid thinking, where's the good one? If there's a bad one, why isn't there a good one? Because good is irrelevant if you're not wise.
Yes.
Wisdom is everything. And of course, we all know, I knew this. This is what my great revelation of my younger life when I was at Columbia in graduate school. Why is there no wisdom at Columbia? It was driving me crazy. My teachers were brilliant, and they had no wisdom. And then I realized wisdom begins with fear of God.
Yes.
So no God, no wisdom, no goodness. Those are the equations of life, and we're living the reality, tragically, of the absence of wisdom.
And I think that one of the points that you've made before, and we certainly see this now with things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, whatever that list might be, and it's a long and growing list every single day with some of the candidates, is they always want to do good, but the Affordable Care Act has not been affordable. The so-called shovel-ready projects didn't turn out to be shovel-ready, and so everybody had the motive of trying to do good, but the reality is they did not understand what the structural limitations were.
And they don't understand the consequences. Wisdom is consequences. If you give children, here's one nobody thinks about, or very few. If you give children free lunch and free breakfast at public school, like they do in California now, what are you saying? You're saying we are your parents, not your parents.
Good point.
If parents don't give their children breakfast and lunch, they are not their parents. That ends parenthood. The most basic thing a parent does is feed their child.
Yes. But again, this idea of wisdom, it also gets back to just motive. You know, there's sometimes, Dennis, when people will say, well, they had good motives. And I said, well, I can
So what?
Yeah. I've seen individuals, for example, former President Bill Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Act. Now, his motive wasn't very good because he just wanted to get reelected, and yet it turned out to be pretty good. I can go to George W. Bush and say his motive was to improve education, and yet implemented all sorts of education programs that weren't very good. So motive sometimes
you see, that's the point. You and I get wisdom from something higher than us. Write the Bible, for example, the religious traditions that we come from in addition to the Bible. Where does the secularist, where does that person get their wisdom from? I've done shows on my radio show. I've said, if you don't get your wisdom from the Bible, tell me what book you get it from. And people call in, and it's fascinating. They don't cite a book. They say life experience. So everybody reinvents the wisdom wheel. Do you learn nothing? Do you reinvent physics? Do you reinvent math? Don't you live on what those who preceded you discovered? Why don't we do that with wisdom? Wisdom is knowledge of life, like physics is knowledge of physics. So we live in a foolish age, and what happens if there's no wisdom? It's all feelings.
Yes,
I feel, and that's what it is. And so, and then there's the other thing. If intentions are everything, and I'm on the left, and I know my intentions are noble, that means if you disagree with me, you must be evil.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And that brings us to no safe spaces. That is exactly what our movie is about, the shutting down of non-left thought at universities and campuses around the country.
Let's see if we can talk about that, but it also brings us back to something else that you've put out a YouTube video, which is part of the Prager U. That is, the left destroys everything.
Everything it touches.
Yes.
There's no exception.
Yeah.
Not liberals, not conservatives. They have a mixed bag, fine. Everything the left touched since Lenin until today. And I first realized it, interestingly, in the arts.
Yes.
I conduct orchestras as an avocation, and I know classical music pretty well. They abolished, the left in music, abolished the notion of harmony, the notion of melody, and the notion of tonality. So what are you left with? If you don't have tonality, harmony, and melody...
John Cage, I guess, or something
Well,
like
that's
that.
right. You have notes, random, meaningless notes. That is what, look, and now, do you know how much scatological art there is? I wrote about this. I've documented it. The New York Times about a year ago had a gigantic art review of, forgive me, but that was the title, Giant Poops at a Dutch museum.
Yes.
Bigger than humans. Sculpted poop. And this is considered art.
Talk about the movie for just a minute, because that's something we want to promote as well. But even while you were talking about the symphony, it was controversial for you to actually conduct the symphony.
That's
We've
right.
talked about that.
Yes, isn't that amazing? It was depressing. The whole point should have been, look at that. Conservative conductor, liberal left orchestra, Santa Monica Symphony Orchestra, but what brings them together? Music. They can make music together. Instead, we're not going to play for him. He's right wing. But the truth is, out of 70 musicians, 63 did play for me. Only 7 refused to. And that's what the New York Times wrote about, the 7.
Yes. Well, and again, back to this idea of feelings and things like that. We've had Jonathan Haidt on, of course, wrote the book, co-authored the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, in which you're supposed to trust your feelings instead of facts. And that's one of the things in your column that just came out recently you talk about as well. Just one of those truisms that's been turned on their head.
That's why I call this the age of feelings. New York Times had a piece 2 weeks ago. I couldn't believe it. It was written by a nutritionist, and I'm interested in nutrition. So I read the whole piece, and the article was, don't put your kid on a diet. Diets are bad for kids. So I immediately knew only the New York Times would publish such drivel. And then at the end, you won't believe this. It's almost unbelievable. It said, do not tell your child what to eat. Let them trust their wisdom with regard to food. Their inner wisdom. But a child's inner wisdom is another
Candy.
ice cream sundae.
Yeah. It's just crazy. Let me, for just a few more minutes, because I know I need to let you go soon, talk about a couple of other things in the news. And one of those is, whose bright idea was it to bring the Taliban to Camp David? I just have to get
I don't
your
know whose
comments on
idea. It was probably the president's, and I'm a big supporter of the president, but truth comes before opinion. That's the motto of my show. I trust him in that even if he had them, I don't think anything would have happened.
Right.
But the beauty is, hey, I was going to talk to you, but you keep blowing up human beings. Goodbye. The American people have to say, look, we don't want to be there, but we don't want to be in Korea, and we don't want to be in Germany, and we don't want to be in Japan. But because we're in Germany, Japan, and Korea, people are free, and there's no war. So we may have to hang around in Afghanistan indefinitely. I'm prepared to pay that price.
And again, the same thing with ISIS. I think we learned a lesson from the previous president that said, well, we've defeated ISIS, we'll leave. And
Let's
then
get
ISIS,
going. You hit it on the nose.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, I know that we are a war-weary people as America.
Everybody is war-weary.
But the reality is, there are evil people in the world.
That's right. I'm telling you, this is why I talk about Judeo-Christian values. You're a Christian, I'm a Jew. Look at how in sync we are.
Yes.
No, this is very important for people to realize, because we get our wisdom from the same spot. And we both agree with the psalmist. Those of you who love God must hate evil. That's my favorite verse in the Bible, by the way.
It's interesting.
If you don't hate evil, you don't love God. I'd always point that out to people.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dennis Prager right after these important messages.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medishare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medishare works, and it could save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE 40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Dennis Prager was with us in studio and just wanted you to hear the rest of that interview. Let me just mention that we did talk about the No Safe Spaces movie. We have a trailer that you can watch. It's about 2.5 minutes long. It will be coming out in October, and as we get closer to the release of that film, I wanted to spend some time talking about that. But since he was in studio with us, we did talk about that particular movie that you may want to know about. Dennis Prager, Adam Carolla, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro. It's a kind of a who's who. Alan Dershowitz, all sorts of people on that movie. So that is something that you can find out a little bit more about by going to our website, pointofview.net. But just a minute ago, we were talking about the fact that we live in a very dangerous world. And his argument is we may have to keep troops in some of these areas to keep the peace. But I did want to talk a little bit more about how to think about that from a Judeo-Christian point of view.
They don't think the world is dangerous. They think America's dangerous.
We're the source of all evil.
They're, or nearly all, they are they have the truly broken moral compass. So you might have seen since you read my columns, I'm very touched. You might have seen the one where I said how the left keeps me religious.
Oh, yes, I saw that.
And that is God's honest truth. Because whenever I have any questions, I look at the left, the people who loathe the Judeo-Christian tradition and its value system, and I realize, wow, look at what that produces, and I'm right back in the religious camp.
Let me, just before I let you go, talk about anti-Semitism, one of the other booklets here, because that is something we've been talking about, and certainly as an individual that's been watching this play out for decades, literally, this is a source of concern. One of the things I'm noticing right now is that a lot of people are talking about hate crimes going up and increasing. But if you look at the hate crimes, most of them are anti-Semitic hate crimes.
And most of those are committed by minorities.
Yes.
But that's why they're not reported.
Yeah.
That's why the New York Times doesn't want to tell you about it. There was an article in Tablet, one of the biggest Jewish, it's not liberal or conservative, just a Jewish run major internet place, and two big articles on how many Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn are getting just bashed in the head while walking in the street. It's almost always black or Hispanic doing it. Nobody reports it. Not de Blasio says, "Oh, maybe we'll investigate it," but nothing happens. Look, the whole thing's a tragedy because everything the left touches, including the battle against anti-Semitism. If you call Donald Trump an anti-Semite or a dog whistler to anti-Semites, man with Jewish daughter-in-law, a Jewish daughter now, and Jewish grandchildren.
It's hard to even believe.
I mean, please, you're out of your minds.
Yeah.
Anyway, forgive me. I just got to tell everybody, because this is so big, this No Safe Spaces movie. It's coming out in October.
Yes.
And it'll be at theaters near you, folks. And I'm in it with Adam Carolla, and the people who made the Dinesh D'Souza films made it. This is a truly great film. If you care about America's future, please see No Safe Spaces.
And one of the reasons we talk about that is one of the other booklets we have on the politics of hate is just this whole idea of safe spaces and Twitter triggers and all those kinds of things.
Unbelievable.
It's just the kinds of things that we're dealing with right now. And so we're obviously going to put it on our website and encourage people to go.
Good. Thank you.
But talk about how we can promote that, because it seems to me that we need to send a signal to Hollywood that those kinds of films are ones that we want more people to go to.
Well, that's right. I always say to my listeners, I say, look, go to a conservative movie, even if you have no interest in the subject, just to support the making of non-left-wing films.
Right.
But in this case, don't do it to support the filmmakers. Do it because it's such an important film. And as they will see, I've seen it 4 times.
Mm-hmm.
I will see it a 5th because it holds my interest every time, and it's hard to hold my interest. I think God gave me a very short attention span as a gift to make me interesting, because I remember when I first started lecturing, my voice said to me once, Dennis, you're boring me.
Yeah.
So if I started to bore me, I thought that was a bad sign.
Yes. Well, my wife will tell you that she'll tell me when we need to move on to the next topic. That's the same kind of thing.
Right.
But again, this is going to be in the theaters.
No safe
and we're going to promote it.
Good. Thank
and
you.
do what we can. But again, we really encourage some of our listeners when we do this to get your Sunday school class and everybody
That's
show
right.
up.
And your liberal brother-in-law.
Yes.
Because we have a lot of liberals. This is a perfect example. We have a lot of liberals saying this is a crisis. This closing down of conservative thought on campus is a crisis.
Yes, it is.
A lot of liberals saying this.
Mm-hmm.
No leftist says it. That's why among the reasons it's so important.
So again, this idea that what does not actually kill me makes me stronger, but instead it's kind of turned on its head. It says, what does not kill me makes me weaker, so I don't want to listen to those ideas.
Right.
And there's no free speech, and you don't have a right, and we need safe spaces, and we have trigger warnings and all those kinds of things. So,
well, that is exactly right. What we're not doing is we're not growing boys and girls into men and women. We're keeping them boys and girls. As I often say, college, the difference between college and kindergarten is the age of the kinder.
Yes. Well, let's, if we can, encourage people also to go to your website. It's DennisPrager.com.
Right, and PragerU.
And PragerU.
Right, and
sign up and
by
get
the
that.
way, do you know about my Bible commentary?
I do. And you have
the
one on
Rational
Genesis.
Bible,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Genesis and Exodus have come out
right
so
there.
far.
And again, those are some topics. And if nothing else, let's see if we can find that 9 commandments.
I know that. I know.
That is just an incredible set of
I love that you knew
circumstances.
about that. Thank you.
Well, if nothing else, one more time, let's just encourage people to go to the website, and we'll have some material on the website. And I just appreciate you giving us some time today here at Point of View.
It's a real delight to be with you.
In the conversation we had with Dennis Prager recently, and we'll see if we can get him in again. It's the first time I had a chance to meet him face-to-face. We've interviewed him by phone before and might mention his commentary and a few things. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One more time, I thought I'd mention that movie coming out next month, No Safe Spaces. And it is a movie that has, as I said, Adam Carolla, Dennis Prager, Jordan Peterson, Alan Dershowitz, Ben Shapiro. The list goes on and on. And so we'll certainly, as we get closer to that next month, spend some time talking about that and encourage you to attend the movie, to get your Sunday school class or your friends to go as well. 800-351-1212. And I thought, just before I take some phone calls, I might get into a couple of issues in the news, and one that we have not talked about until now, and it's worth mentioning for a few minutes, is the phone call from President Donald Trump to the leader of Ukraine. The argument that has been made is that this July 25th call actually involves something that could lead to the impeachment of the president. Today, the Wall Street Journal put it by reminding us that, first of all, this was an unidentified intelligence source. And so, first of all, one of the application points is there are a lot of people listening into the president. Now, some of those are, of course, supposed to do so, but I get the sense that sometimes these transcripts get passed around. And so that's, first of all, one of the concerns. And one of the things they actually bring up a little bit later in this piece by the Wall Street Journal is just go back and imagine if we all of a sudden now have people wanting to release the private phone calls of the president, because after all, you can think of John F. Kennedy's various calls during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can think of, as they say, Richard Nixon and some of his calls during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. I would add another one, since we're talking about Richard Nixon. How about some of the back-channel conversation of Kennedy, the back-channel conversation of Nixon opening up China? We don't want that in that particular direction. And so the argument has been made that Mr. Trump asked the president, the new president of Ukraine, to maybe begin to investigate some of the things that happened because of Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. So certainly that is the case. One of the things that Gary Bauer, I think, mentions the fact is that it's quite possible that all this controversy surrounding this call could have been just another one of Donald Trump's jokes. After all, the newly elected president of Ukraine, if you don't know, he's a former comedian. And, of course, we might remember when Donald Trump at one point, when he was running his campaign, candidate Trump said, Russia, if you're listening here and you've got those deleted emails by Hillary Clinton, you might make those available. There'd be some people in the press that would be interested. That was a joke, although a lot of people use that as the justification for investigating the president. It's quite possible he might have made simply a joke. But when we come back, let's talk about some of the possible dangers of this and what might actually ensue as there is this investigation now of Donald Trump and the phone call to the president of Ukraine. So that is one of those issues. I thought I'd also bring to you a couple of other facts and figures that we'll talk about in terms of have the number of tweets by the president increased or decreased? I'll give you a hint. They've increased dramatically. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then also one very good piece by our friend Jim Garrity, kind of inside the mind of those individuals that are now supporting Senator Elizabeth Warren. She is making a move in the polls, and so we'll talk about some of those issues right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that tomorrow is our Tuesday Millennial Roundtable. Nick Pitts will be here with a number of guests. Wednesday, we have Max Lucado with us on his new book on happiness, as well as Matt Staver, and we'll get into some other very important issues in the news. So all of that is front and center. So let me just mention that, again, this particular phone call, Donald Trump's call that actually relates to Ukraine, is certainly one of those issues in the news. We'll keep following it. But again, there is an unidentified intelligence source who's been called kind of a whistleblower. And one of the things that our friends at the Wall Street Journal said is this underscores Donald Trump's flaw as a president, in which it's what they call political narcissism. Every decision boils down to how it affects his election or re-election. But at the same time, there are some really significant concerns about the actions of Hunter Biden, who is Joe Biden's son, then the way in which Joe Biden interfered and intervened in some of that. So that is certainly another issue. But it also leads to one other point, and that is almost every time one of these particular allegations or accusations comes forward, we go through the same kind of process. And the editors at the Wall Street Journal put it this way: little of the breathless reporting about Mr. Trump's Ukraine call stops to note that Democrats in the Clinton campaign financed foreign accusations against, at that time, then candidate Donald Trump to defeat him in the 2016 election. Those accusations, though uncorroborated, were used to justify wiretaps against at least one Trump campaign official and gin up a 2-year special counsel investigation that severely damaged the Trump presidency, all without finding evidence of a Trump-Russia collusion. But they conclude their piece by saying all of this is likely to play out in the familiar Trump-era fashion, with Democrat Representative Adam Schiff making claims that turned out to be exaggerated, the media hyping impeachment, and then Donald Trump fighting back in tweets that call the whole thing a hoax. Without evidence of worse behavior by Donald Trump, nothing much more likely is to come of it. And I guess the bigger issue is what this might mean for the idea of a precedent. Jim Garrity points this out. He says, just picture what happens next if the American people decide that it is legal and ethical for an American president to urge foreign leaders to investigate his political opponents, as it appears Donald Trump encouraged Ukrainian leaders to do in the case of Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. Someday there will be another Democratic president. The country could see another Democratic president as soon as January 20th, 2021. Or it could be sometime many years after that, but someday there will be one. And the future Democratic president could use this exact same tactic against his or her potential Republican challengers. The future Democratic president could urge Iraq or Afghanistan to investigate Dan Crenshaw's units to see if they violate any rules of engagement. Or the Democratic president could urge Germany to investigate whether Nikki Haley and the South Carolina state government ever did anything unethical or cut corners in their agreements to bring BMW production plants to South Carolina, and on and on. You can go through the long list and imagine. So again, part of the concern is what seems sometimes unprecedented in one particular situation becomes a justification for the next president. So there are some important issues that we'll be discussing throughout the week. But just before we run out of time, I did mention that our friends at Market Watch actually have been keeping track of the tweets by Donald Trump. And that's something I haven't done, but they have charts to show that now he's tweeting 43% more than he was in the past. So some of you that are hoping that he would stop tweeting, actually he's increased it rather dramatically. And they've also kept track of how long he speaks at some of the rallies. His rally speeches are now 26% longer than they were before as well. Just before we go, though, let me mention that one of my other articles I've posted here is on the Supreme Court gun case. It's entitled Heller's Precarious Situation. And one of the reasons I brought it up is because I thought, had some pretty solid decisions about guns, handguns, and all the rest. In 2008, you had what is known as the Heller decision. It was the District of Columbia versus Heller. It had to do with
very significant restrictions placed upon individuals in the District of Columbia. It banned handguns and required that long guns would be stored unloaded in a locked cabinet, so in a sense making them usable for self-defense. 2 years later, then you have the McDonald versus Chicago particular case, which had to do with the handgun bans in Chicago and 6 of its suburbs. And in both of these particular cases, first of all, in the Heller case, of course, it ruled that this is unconstitutional. In the McDonald case, they even ruled that the Second Amendment is not a second-class right to be singled out for special and especially unfavorable treatment. But as I point out in the article here, and you can read it in its entirety, this is now surfacing once again because of a case that is going to the court from New York. And it will be an opportunity for the Supreme Court to give further direction and ruling in this area of the idea of the Second Amendment, or maybe even to make it more confusing. And up until that time, up until 2008, there was an argument that was used quite often that, in a sense, the Second Amendment only applies to militia, only applies to organized or groups, but does not actually provide an individual right to arms. 2008 did indeed say that it is an individual right. And so we'll see about some of these other bans that exist, because in certain places around the country, the right to bear arms is pretty much denied in Hawaii and Maryland and New Jersey, according to this particular article in the National Review. It's also true in certain cities or counties in places like California, New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. So we'll see how broad that decision is, but it's one of those topics that we mentioned in passing on Friday, and I thought I'd post this article so you could read about that as well. But just before we take a break, let me just also mention that there was a very good piece by Jim Garrity called Inside the Mind of the Warren Voter. And the argument he's making is that some of the people that have been supporting Elizabeth Warren realize that Donald Trump pulled off a trick. And they have come to realize that, because you might remember that during the campaign, candidate Donald Trump used to talk about the fact that everything was rigged. The election was rigged, the media was rigged, the polls were rigged, and the system is totally rigged, he used to say, if you might remember that. And it's kind of interesting because he reminds us that now that's exactly what Elizabeth Warren is saying as well. Now, she's using the term rigged in a different way. It's rigged against the small investor because it's rigged in favor of Wall Street. It's rigged in favor of the medical insurance companies. It's rigged in a number of different ways. But it was kind of interesting to see that the obvious individual who is going to be running for re-election and a person who might indeed run against him are both using the term rigged. And if indeed that is the case, it will certainly make the 2020 presidential election so interesting, because they'll both be talking about how the system is rigged, but they'll be talking about entirely different things, I would imagine. And so I thought it was just a very interesting observation that both Donald Trump, when he ran the first time, talked about the system is rigged, and now, as she is running for the presidency, Elizabeth Warren is talking about the system is rigged, but they're, of course, talking about very different parts of the economy and the government. Well, that's all we have for today. If you'd like to listen again to the Dennis Prager interview, or like to watch it on YouTube, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Hope some of you might click on that button and join the Truth Team. We still need your financial support. And most importantly, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.